I mean, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about what's happening nationally and what has happened nationally in terms of anti-Muslim hate groups and propaganda and so on. Maybe this will be a little disjointed, but I thought I would start out talking about hate crimes and what the statistics tell us about hate crimes. Prior to 9/11, prior to 2001, there were virtually no anti-Muslim hate crimes in the United States. When you look at the FBI national hate crime stats, what you see are things like 26, 28, 34, in a country of 300 million people, right? I guess 30 too many, but really utterly insignificant when looked at compared to the size of the country. That said, when 9/11 happened, to the surprise, I think, of absolutely no one, anti-Muslim hate crimes shot up, in fact, by about 1,600%. And I think it's obvious. It's not surprising 3,000 Americans have just been murdered. And that came as no surprise to anyone. What was a surprise, again, according to the FBI national hate crime statistics, was the fact that in 2002, a mere 3.5 months later, after 9/11, anti-Muslim hate crimes in America went down by 67%, in other words, by a full 2/3. I tell you this story because I'm trying to make the point that what public officials, people in the public eye, say matters a lot and directly translates into hate violence or not. In this case, whatever else anybody in this room might think about George Bush, about President George Bush, the fact is that after 9/11, Bush went out and repeatedly said, again and again, in very public venues, Arabs are not our enemy, Muslims are not our enemy. Our enemy is this very specific group. It's called Al-Qaeda. He also did a bunch of symbolic things. He did things like stand in the National Cathedral and in other religious venues with various imams and so on. So really, in a whole lot of ways, not only sets it sort of lip service, but really made the point that Muslims are not our enemy. This is not a Muslim thing. What happened after that, when you look at the hate crimes, is that they went down. Anti-Muslim hate crimes basically went down, 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 and fairly dramatically in the years after 9/11, all the way until the year 2010. In 2010, they bumped up by 50%. It was completely out of the blue. If you think back to 2010, there was no Charlie Hebdo attack, right? There were not 200 people murdered in Paris or anything like that. There were no Americans beheaded in Northern Africa. There were really no jihadist attacks at all in the United States. So what really happened in 2010? Well, a couple of things. A woman named, a wretched woman named Pam Geller and her partner Robert Spencer basically ginned up a gigantic controversy in New York City over what she called the Victory Mosque. Or the Ground Zero Mosque. As I'm sure most of you know, neither a mosque nor a ground zero. But in any case, this narrative caught on. She was able to create a huge demonstration in New York. And of course, that's the #1 media market in the world, so it was seen all over the United States and elsewhere, and began the series of attacks that we're seeing now, controversies around mosques. For instance, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, places like that, developed their own very big and violent controversies around local mosques. The other things that happened in 2010, there were certain politicians running around, like Newt Gingrich, was saying things publicly, repeatedly during that year, made a couple of different occasions, very public comparisons of all Muslims to Nazis, that kind of thing. The other and very important thing that happened in 2010 was that an American citizen named David Yerushalmi, who's been off and on a part of the very far right wing of the Israeli settlers movement, wrote a report which essentially concluded that there was a Muslim plot in America to impose Sharia law in American courts, in particular criminal courts. And Yerushalmi also wrote model legislation called American Laws for American Courts, which now 7 states have passed. Missouri's was vetoed. One other was found, Oklahoma's was found unconstitutional. But the point is, as I'm sure everyone in the room understands, it is simply impossible to impose Sharia law on American courts with regard to criminal matters. It's a fantasy, a propaganda designed to demonize Muslims. In any case, all of those things happened in 2010, and what I'm arguing is that that ultimately, in a pretty direct way, translated into criminal violence. And let me just say from our experience at SPLC, of hate criminals, people who actually go out and shoot Muslim people or beat people up or attack mosques and so on. The surprising thing is that an awful lot of hate criminals think that they are heroes, right? They don't see themselves as sort of gutter scum beating up sort of grandmas and children. They see themselves as the noble, brave young men standing up for their community, defending it against the threats that face them, and so on. And so, when a Newt Gingrich or somebody like that stands up and makes these kinds of statements, it's a permission giving, right? It's a way of saying, you're really right to think those Muslims are out to do you in, and nobody would be too bothered were you to, beat one up, that kind of thing. Obviously, this has gimmed up a whole lot recently with Donald Trump. I'll talk a little bit about that. Let me say, I'm going to rush through some of these things I want to say. First of all, the FBI hate crime statistics, just so you know, are now known to vastly understate the real level of hate crimes. That's known, for instance, the Department of Justice studies that found, for a number of reasons, kind of irrelevant to tonight's talk, that the real level of hate crimes in America is about 25 to 40 times higher than what the FBI statistics suggest. Times higher, not percent. So rather than 7,000 to 11,000 hate crimes a year, the real number is about 260,000. I tell you that just because if you look at FBI stats and you might see 137 anti-Muslim hate crimes, the reality is it's probably 30 or 40 times that number. In any event, since 2010, the numbers again started to fall a bit. But then in 2014, which is the latest number we have FBI hate crime statistics for, while every other category of hate crime in America dropped, anti-Muslim hate crimes went up 14%. And this was just at the kind of the beginning of the Islamic State in the news, right? I mean, Taylor Mueller was beheaded in North Africa. The Islamic State is doing things like burning Jordanian pilots alive in cages, real horror stories. So it was just beginning to penetrate American consciousness, and you see this 14%. Not only due, I should say, to real atrocities, but also to the propaganda work of the kinds of people I'm going to discuss, Robert Spencer, Pam Geller, and a number of others. Then, of course, 2015 was a terrible year. In terms of various atrocities, right? It begins with Charlie Hebdo, it ends with the final attacks in Paris. In between we have San Bernardino, where 14 people are murdered, and so on. And then, as I mentioned earlier, of course, then you have Donald Trump, right, saying these incredible things, these absolutely astounding things about Muslims, along with a whole lot of other politicians. So I'm saying all this to say we don't have the statistics for 2015, but I am here to promise you that anti-Muslim hate crimes will go up dramatically when the FBI releases those numbers around next Thanksgiving, next November. One of the things we do at SPLC is we list and search out and list and identify hate groups. According to us, for whatever it's worth, we never identified a hate group that was solely focused on Muslims, whose predominant purpose was to basically hate on Muslims. Even after 9/11, for several years, none of those groups appeared. The first year we saw any dedicated anti-Muslim hate groups was, in fact, in 2010, the very same year. I'm talking about the statistics jumping up when we had 5. That number has continued to grow and grow. Today, again, according to our count, there are 34 anti-Muslim hate groups. And, I don't have time to go through them all, but let me just say some of the huge ones are Act for America, led by Bridget Gabriel, the largest anti-Muslim group by far. It claims something like, I don't remember, like 900 chapters, I think it claims, in the United States and abroad. And I think, while it may not actually be that big, it's very large. The American Freedom Defense Initiative is Pam Geller's little vehicle, and you may remember them as the sponsors of the Muhammad Art Contest, quote unquote, in Garland, Texas last year, which was held essentially as a provocation to kind of shove in the faces of Muslims, to face their prophet, and so on. The Center for Security Policies group, led by a former government official by the name of Frank Gaffney, who was a wild conspiracy theorist. Frank Gaffney is the person who created the fake poll which claimed that 25% of American Muslims support violent jihad of the sort carried out by Islamic Jihad. This is the poll that was quoted by Donald Trump when he made his big statement about banning Muslims and so on. And the poll was completely false. It wasn't a poll, it's what they call an opt-in poll. You just go to the website, if you feel like saying something, you do. There have been real polls of American Muslims that show that's not even remotely close to true, the numbers infinitesimal. In any event, there are another place, the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Horowitz is a nasty fellow who used to be very much on the left and has now had some sort of conversion. And one of the things that Horowitz does is he creates these organizations on campus whose job it is to identify professors who are too sympathetic to Muslims or to left-wing causes in general. In other words, kind of new campus McCarthyism. Horowitz also runs Jihad Watch, which does very much the same thing. Another big organization is Stop Islamization of America. That is also Pam Geller. Let me talk now a little bit about the kind of some major propagandists and what they are saying. You know, I, as a reporter, covered the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, and I will never forget something that happened immediately afterwards. The bombing was on Wednesday. Tim McVeigh was arrested on Friday morning. On Thursday, people like Steve Emerson, who was a quote-unquote terrorism expert, self-described and much used at one time by various television stations. That day, Emerson was on TV saying that this attack had all the hallmarks of a Middle Eastern attack, a Muslim attack. Clearly, this was so. He wasn't the only one. But Emerson is the one who really pushed it out there. Emerson, by the way, much more recently, about 6 months, is the one who was humiliated when he claimed on national television that London and other places had no-go zones due to scary Muslims. He was mocked mercilessly by, among other people, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, for this completely absurd and baseless statement. In any case, while Emerson said these things immediately after Oklahoma City, the day before, as I say, McVeigh was arrested. There was an Iranian Muslim woman in northern Oklahoma whose home was surrounded by a mob of people, not really a mob, it was a bunch of trucks racing by her car and throwing things and so on, and scared her to death. This woman miscarried and lost a 7-month-old child, thanks to, in a fairly extenuated way, people like Steve Emerson, people who assume that the mass murderers out there have got to be Muslims. So she paid the price. Yara Shalmev talked about already, very important character. The Sharia law idea, this conspiracy theory is huge still in many, many states. 7 states, I mentioned that already. There are other conspiracy theories that are very much in the mainstream now, and they are enabled, again, by politicians, by congressmen, by U.S. senators, by people who ought to know better. For instance, the idea that there are 22 to 35, depending on which conspiracy theory you're looking at, secret Muslim terrorist training camps in America. It turns out the vast majority of these are actually small communities that were started by black Muslims in the 60s and have nothing to do with jihad or training or paramilitary training or anything like that, but nevertheless, this is the kind of thing you will hear again and again repeated by the Sean Hannitys of the world and some of the other occupants of Fox News. There's a congressman from San Diego, Duncan Hunter, who last year made the claim, utterly false, that he had sources on the border who knew that 10 ISIS fighters had already been stopped, and that was like a month after Paris, already been stopped at the Mexican border. That is completely false. There has never been an ISIS fighter stopped at the Mexican border, but this is the fear program. This is the propaganda that's out there trying to scare us all. We shouldn't forget the Peter King hearings. Congressman Peter King in 2011 held these hearings, which were essentially, what's wrong with Muslims hearings, under the guise of, a broad look at terrorism. It wasn't that at all. Other propagandists have said things like, there are prayer shawls found all the time at the U.S. border in Mexico. They've made claims that there are secret training camps in Mexico, a little different than the ones in the United States. And what these training camps supposedly do, like in Ciudad Juarez and places like that, is they take Muslims and they train them to look and act like Mexican laborers, right? I guess they give them a sombrero or something and then they and tell them to go, work the farm labor circuit. These ideas are actually circulated by people who are ostensibly serious characters. Obviously, now 62% of Trump voters believe that Obama is secretly a Muslim. I think I need to tell you that that's rather silly and not based in any kind of fact. Also, this idea which is pressed very much by people like Frank Gaffney, that there was a secret Muslim Brotherhood plot, about 30 years old, to take over the United States. Gaffney made this accusation against so many people that it enraged other people on the extreme right. For instance, he of course accused Huma Abedin, Hillary Clinton's aide, of being an agent of the Muslim Brotherhood, but he also accused Grover Norquist, an old right-wing anti-tax activist, very far on the right, of also being part of this Muslim Brotherhood plot, because why? Well, he has a beard and he was married to a Muslim woman. So, enough said. And now we even have some people who I used to admire quite a bit, some very well-known atheists, Bill Maher, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris, now who kind of joined the Muslim bashing club, which is an awful shame to see. Obviously, Trump and the presidential race has ginned up this whole thing to a level that is quite amazing. And just so, I'm sure most people in the room remember the details, but let me just remind you, he called for banning Muslims from this country, all Muslims, supposedly temporarily. He called for creating a database to register and track Muslims like they were members of the mafia in the United States. He made the claim, utterly false, that 25% of American Muslims, as I said, support violent jihad. Trump claimed to have personally witnessed thousands and thousands of Muslims in Jersey City cheering on September 11, 2001, as the World Trade Center buildings came crashing down. This was a conspiracy theory, or really just a tall tale told by many people at the time, but it was shown to be utterly false by media investigations as well as by real law enforcement investigations. It never happened, and it's not like there were just 2 people, not 200 or 3,000. There were no people killed. This is simply a falsehood. So, I think it's worth pointing out that Trump is not the only malefactor. People who are supposed to be big moderates in the Republican race. Jeb Bush was, Mr. Nice Guy compared to the rest of those people, and he was saying, well, we can let in some Christian refugees, but they've got to be Christians, right? That kind of thing. That's the kind of thing we're hearing from them. Cruz and Huckabee and others have said things that are a whole lot nastier than that. Just again, to make the point that the words of these politicians have consequences. Wrap up quickly. It is worth remembering that Trump's first speech in this campaign was a speech where he described Mexicans as rapists and drug dealers. It was only about 3 weeks after that that a Latino man in Boston was beaten up very badly by 2 brothers using steel pipes. When they were arrested, which happened immediately, they told the police, they cited Donald Trump, right? That's the reason they did it, because Donald Trump says they're rapists and murderers, somebody's got to do something about it. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. It's not often you actually get your perpetrator saying, it's the politician who kind of convinced me to do this, but in this case it happened. I don't need to tell people in this room, I don't think, there's been an incredible uptick in anti-Muslim violence and hatred. I was looking at my emails and sitting here, and the last 2 hours, there are like 3 anti-Muslim attacks that have just come in over the wires. There have been mosques attacked in Washington, Texas, Indiana, Kentucky, Nebraska, and any number of other places. In Philadelphia, where a severed pig's head was thrown into a mosque. There have been, people breaking into mosques and desecrating the Quran with feces, right? That's happened on a couple of occasions. And it goes on and on and on. 3 Sudanese men were essentially executed a few weeks ago in Indiana. It's still unclear exactly what that was about, but that's exactly how the cops are describing it. Execution-style, gangster-style murders. Then we have all the rest of the attacks on taxi drivers, on Uber drivers, on little children having their hijabs yanked off at school. Incredible level of bullying. CARE has done some really good surveys on the enormous percentages of Muslim children who go through this kind of bullying in their schools. Just a couple of days ago, this woman I keep mentioning, Pam Gill, who really is a wretched human being, learned the news that the Muslim woman in America has qualified to be an Olympic fencer, and she is being allowed to fence in hijab. And to Pam Keller, this is yet another example of Islamist supremacism. So I want to wrap up just by saying, I don't mean in any event, this one or any other, to suggest that there is no threat from Islamist radicals or the Islamic State. Obviously there is. Very many people have been murdered by these groups and individuals who are part of this movement. But there is also a very substantial and essentially equal kind of threat from the domestic radical right, from white supremacists, neo-Nazis, Klansmen, and so on. Again, I don't mean to diminish one at the expense of the other. They're both very real. But it is worth understanding that according to the best count, since 9/11, and that's a big since, I understand 3,000 people died that day, but since 9/11, more people in America have been killed by domestic radical right-wing extremists than by jihadists. And if you were to count the killings carried out by white supremacists and others that weren't political, in other words, they killed their girlfriend, they killed their family, they're always heard on a bunch of people getting into these kinds of things, then the numbers would be vastly higher. There was a study done in 2011 by the Triangle Center for the Study of Terrorism in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and they looked at that point at 120 jihadist plots that had occurred in the United States since 9/11, and what they found was that 48% of those plots were stopped before anyone was hurt because information was brought to the police, to law enforcement, by Muslims, right? So when Peter King gets on national television and says the problem with Muslims is they won't talk to police or they won't tell us when these things are happening, he is lying, to put it plain. That is simply not true. The only other thing I want to say is that when you go to police, not exactly the most flaming liberal bunch of people in the world, but professional. A major survey was done on police agencies last year, and what it found was that 74% of police departments and sheriff's departments see anti-government domestic American radicals as more of a threat than any kind of jihadist attack. So that's all I want to say. I just want to kind of paint a picture of what I think is happening out there.